Hey, Zach.
I'm in the room on a Wednesday on time for once. This has never happened. This is revolutionary.
Whoa, what's happening? You're on time on a Wednesday?
I'm in the room at about 1 o'clock on Wednesday. This is amazing.
Okay, you know what's perhaps more amazing is that I had never picked up on the fact that Wednesdays were a particular problem for you to get into that room on time. That's funny. I never really noticed that. Huh, weird. Well, now, this makes me wonder about the Winchester Thurston people. I don't think that they're specifically, I don't think Wednesday is a specific problem for them. So I'm not sure where they are. I know that not everyone is going to be here today, but I certainly expected someone from Winchester Thurston, although sometimes it just takes a little time for them to clear out that room, so.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I don't have an agenda slide today, because I thought we would just see where the discussion went. Let's see here. Well, is there anything in particular you're hoping to talk about today? Oh, here we go. Okay, cool.
We're here.
Hey.
Is it 7-11?
All right, now let me try doing.
What? No, that's PM. Never mind.
That's always been wrong.
That's always been wrong? Okay.
It's never the right time.
Okay.
Ever. Usually in the 4 or 5. Wait, is the camera even on us?
No. It's just a black screen.
Oh.
Okay. I assume they're going to try again. All right, well. Let me advance the slide to the first slide. Just kind of setting up the mind-body problem again, now that we've been through all these views.
I had kind of a question. So with the mind-body problem, there's the brain-mind identity theorists, and then there are functionalists. Is functionalism basically a more general version of brain-mind identity? Because you're saying that the brain-mind identity says the brain itself is the mind, and the functionalist says that the stuff that does pretty much what the brain does, which is mental, is the mind. So would it be accurate to say that functionalism is just a more general version of brain-mind identity? And also, are there really that many people that support the brain-mind identity thesis today?
Oh, there was a cap lens on their camera. That was the problem. So that's a good question, Zach. And just while you guys are setting up, I'll restate the question. The question is whether there are very many people who support the mind-brain identity theory anymore, and whether functionalism can be viewed as just sort of a more general version of that theory. Functionalists don't like to call themselves mind-brain identity theorists because they reject any proposed identity between mental states considered as a kind, like pain or the thought of Paris or an experience of green. They reject any identity of that kind of state with a particular kind of physical state. Unless the way you characterize a physical state is functionally, right? So you might say that, well, what makes this the kind of physical state it is not what it's made of, but what it does, right? It's the kind of state that has these kinds of causes and these kinds of effects. So if that's your conception of a physical state, then yeah, it is a kind of identity theory. But what it will reject is any particular specification of that physical state in terms of, say, the firing of a particular kind of neuron, because a functionalist is always going to say, well, you could have an alternative physical construction that performs the same role as these neurons do in this kind of creature. Okay. So, good. But functionalists are physicalists to the extent that they think that the actual state that plays the relevant role will always be a physical state.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so as I was saying to Zach, as you guys were kind of getting set up, this slide here is just sort of a summary of the mind-body problem as we've looked at it to this point, right? I think the simplest way to say what the problem is that we've got two claims. One of them's got to be false, and yet there seems to be something interesting to be said for each one. On the one hand, we've got reason to think that mental states must be physical states of the creature or the being. And on the other hand, we have reason to think that they can't be. Those are contradictory, so one of them's got to go in favor of the claim that mental states must be physical states, the causal argument, right? And the key idea at work in the causal argument just is the idea that some conscious states, some mental states cause physical events, movements of the body, vocalizations, and so forth. And the other way around too, right? Things that happen in the body and in the environment cause you to have mental states of certain kinds. The main kind of problem with this position is just that mental states and physical states seem so different, and it can be very hard to accept the claim that things that seem so patently different could be one and the same. It's almost like being told that justice could be an automobile. One wonders how on earth things that seem so different could be one and the same. So on the other side, in favor of the view that mental states aren't physical states, can't be physical states, are things like the zombie argument, the knowledge argument, and so forth. In favor of these kinds of views, they seem to preserve this intuition of distinctness. But the big problem for this view is epiphenomenalism, the view that mental states don't cause anything. So notice that there's a funny kind of inversion between the case for and problems for one view and the other, right? The problem for anti-physicalist views is epiphenomenalism, and that has to do with the causal role of mental states. It's that very point that mental states seem to have physical causes and effects that the materialist uses to argue that in favor of her position, right? Whereas the problem for materialism, intuition of distinctness, is precisely what the anti-physicalist can refer to in support of hers. So it's interesting, the exchange there. And so deciding between these things largely is a matter of deciding which plausible claim you think gets priority, right? Is the more plausible claim. It's largely a matter of deciding, well, which counterintuitive consequence am I most willing to accept, or which do I think is most rational to accept? And just real quick, let me skip that actually. Materialists try to diffuse the so-called intuition of distinctness, right? The sense that mental states and physical states are so different. by embracing this view called conceptual dualism. And conceptual dualism is a dualism in the way that we think about things, right? It's not a dualism in the world. This is materialism after all. There's only one kind of stuff, physical stuff, one kind of property, physical properties. But it's a difference in how we think about things, and in particular, a difference in the way we think about the mind. We have our third person, objective, physico-functional way of thinking about the mind, right? In terms of maybe what's happening in the brain, things that anyone can understand independent of having the experience in question, right? You don't have to have any particular experience in order to understand what it means to have a certain kind of neural activity in your visual cortex, right? Jacob has shared with us that he's colorblind, but he can understand perfectly well. So you said you don't see the difference between red and purple, right? Is that what you told me?
Blue and purple.
Blue and purple, right. Now there must be some other corresponding thing that you have trouble with in terms of kind of greens and yellows, maybe?
Some greens and some yellows, so even like weird combinations, sometimes even grays and pinks.
Interesting.
But yeah, I can understand what you guys say. I can understand how the eyes can see the different colors. So that's
right. That's the point. You don't need to have the experience in question in order to understand what's going on physically. Yeah. So that's one way of thinking about the mind. The other way is the first person phenomenal way, sometimes called a subjective way. Phenomenal because you're thinking about the mental state in terms of what it's like. So Jacob wonders what might it be like to see purple, or when I look at a blue object and a purple object, am I seeing one of them in the very shade that people who can discriminate blues and purples are seeing? Is one of these what other people call blue, or is it purple, or is it something different, right? Wonder about that. Notice that to understand mental states in this sense requires having the mental state in question. You have to be able to have it in order to understand what's being thought of. That's the sense in which these are subjective. They're dependent on the subject having the experience. So the claim is that we have two very different ways of thinking about the mind. You can't reduce one to the other. They're totally different in that way. No amount of information is going to show that is going to be able to tell you what it's like to have an experience that you've never had, especially if it's very different from one that you've ever had. No amount of talking about what it's like is going to give you the information about the brain, what's happening in the brain, and so forth. But according to the materialist, you can have two very different ways of thinking about something that nevertheless are ways of thinking about one and the same thing, right? So from Papineau's book, the idea that the two different names that name the same guy, Cicero and Tully. That's a very basic way in which you have sort of two different tags or labels for one and the same thing. Okay. Nevertheless, because they're different names, Papineau says a person can perfectly coherently say to herself, Jane might say, Cicero is not Tully. I detect no incoherence in that thought. But if, in fact, those are names of the same person, it's impossible for Cicero to fail to be Tully, because one thing can't fail to be itself, right? That's the idea of how you can conceive of so conceptual dualism not only accounts for the intuition that mental states and brain states are very different, even if they're not, it's also supposed to give an account of things like how it is that you can apparently conceive of a zombie or a ghost, even if that thing is impossible. It gives an account of how it is that Mary can, in some sense, learn something new when she leaves the room, has a new experience, right? She gains this new way of understanding the experience of red, this first-person subjective phenomenal way. Nevertheless, that's a way of knowing about something that, according to the materialist, she knew about in the black and white room. Okay, so no objection to materialism there. So there's a lot there. I know that was quick. We can come back to that. Dualists. All right. So I'm just briefly mentioning how do materialists deal with the big counterintuitive thing. Now, how about dualists and epiphenomenalism? How do they deal with the claim that, oh my gosh, this seems so weird that mental states don't have any causal role to play? So they do some things to suggest that this is really less counterintuitive than it seems at first. And they also say, look, we've got good arguments for our position. And if there's sometimes it's a result of a good argument is something counterintuitive, and you just got to accept that. The way, we might accept that space-time is curved, whatever exactly that means. So anyway, how do they do this? So sometimes they'll appeal to inverted spectra arguments. So the inverted spectrum, you guys have probably all had this thought before. You might wonder, and indeed, Jacob, you presumably do wonder these sorts of things, whether other people see the world exactly as you do. So an inverted spectrum case is one where everyone is gathered around a green object. Everyone says, yeah, that's green. And then there's a red object, and they say, yeah, that one's red. They're different from one another. They're very different from one another. They're more different from one another than, say, oranges from red, and so forth, right? They say all the same things. Nevertheless, it seems possible that the colors are switched for certain people, so that when one person looks at the green one and says that's green, the color they're aware of is, in some sense, the color that another person would call red, even though they call that one green. Yeah, you guys are naughty. You get the idea. That's the inverted spectrum. Notice here that the actual color that you're aware of seems to play no role in what you say or do, right? You all say that one's green, that one's red. They look really different, and so forth. So by thinking about the possibility of these sorts of things, you can start to think, oh, maybe the qualia, maybe I don't really think they do play a role in causing me to do what I do. In which case, it starts to become less counterintuitive that qualia are epiphenomenal. That's one kind of route that they use. The other thing that they'll do is they'll say, qualia still have a role to play, but it's not a causal role. It's a different explanatory role. So here you get the distinction between reasons, explaining something in terms of reasons versus causes. So let me give you a quick example. If I ask you, I see you running down the street one day. I say, why were you running down the street like that? And you'll say, well, I saw the bus was arriving at the stop, and that bus was going somewhere I needed to be, maybe a job interview or something. And so, if I missed that bus, I'd be in big trouble. So I had to catch the bus. That's why I was running. Notice that this explanation of your behavior makes sense of your behavior. It rationalizes why you're doing this otherwise silly thing, running down the street. That's not really that silly, but you get the point. It makes sense of why you're doing that in terms of your goals, right? And what you perceive to be happening. So some people say that you can have, this is a rationalizing explanation. It's not about giving me the cause of your running. The cause of your running has to do with stuff that's happening in your body. But it makes sense of your behavior. And those are two different things. And so some people say that when we explain something in terms of mental states, what we're really doing is rationalizing behavior, making it so that we're rational. You're not giving a causal account of what's happening. So the fact that mental states don't have causes or effects might seem less problematic if this is your view about the role of mental states. So maybe I should give a different example. Look, if all you're trying to do is explain the cause of your behavior, you could say, well, I was in this brain state, and that brain state is the desire for mud, and so the reason I was running down the street after the bus is that I had a strong desire for mud. Now, that sounds funny to say. You might say, what? How? What does the desire for mud have to do with trying to catch a bus? It doesn't. There's a difference between an explanation that makes sense of your behavior. The desire for mud does not make sense of this particular behavior. But look, cause and effect is such that why couldn't that brain state cause you to start running down the street? Okay, so there are a few dualists who actually think that no, we should say that mental states are causes. Qualia cause you to behave in certain ways. But because that's so obvious, we should actually deny the view that's in Papineau's work and that Chalmers accepts, that there's a complete wholly physical explanation for everything you do. There are some who say that. But okay. So that's pretty much it for what I was going to say as an overview of the mind-body problem today. I've got a bunch of flow charts for you today. If you want to look at these two are two different ways of looking at all the different mind-body theories that we've considered. One is in terms of substance, whether they're distinct substances. The other is in terms of properties, mental properties, and what their nature is. The only other thing here is, if you want to talk about this, like, why isn't this a simple solution? Why isn't this an easy way out here? Look, I can account for the fact that mental states cause things, and for the sense in which mental states seem very different from physical states in the following way. Mental states are these things that have two different kinds of properties. Mental states have some physical properties, right? Whatever it is about the neurons or the functional structure of my body. But they also have mental aspects, these non-physical qualitative properties or whatever. Okay? The physical aspects of mental states explain why they can cause behavior, right? Because they have one foot in the brain, so to speak. And the mental aspects explain why they seem so different. One kind of state has two different kinds of properties. What's wrong with this idea? Or at least, why might someone not want to buy this? That's one thing we could talk about. But yeah, Zach.
It seems a bit question-begging.
How so? What question is begged?
That he's establishing that mental states have mental aspects without really explaining the reasoning behind that, besides that they just seem like they do. Or you could say that someone who doesn't think that mental states have mental aspects will immediately disagree with this, so he has to establish why they have mental aspects.
Yeah, okay. Although, so I'm setting up this kind of problem, right? There are these two claims, each of which has something to be said for it, but they can't both be true. And I'm offering this as a way of saying, wait, they can both be true. Well, no, they can't be. Sorry, they can't both be true. But I can account why we are inclined to say each with something that doesn't seem internally inconsistent. Right? Mental states have both physical and mental aspects. That's why they can both cause things to happen in virtue of their physical aspects, and yet they seem very different from other mental states in virtue of their mental aspects. It accounts for both of the ideas that feed into these opposing positions, and yet yeah, you go ahead, Zach, if you want to follow up. Oh, no. Okay. It turns out that Well, in a way, this is something like Chalmers' view, actually. Most, I think, property dualists, this is sort of what they think. But I mean, I know why materialists don't like this view, aside from the fact that it's not materialism. But let me leave that for now. I wanted to let you guys I've done some talking. I want to do less talking now. And let you guys ask questions or bring up what you'd want to talk about more or follow up on.
I have, because this is the day that I missed. Can we go over the Chinese room?
Sure.
Experiment and
sure.
Sort of how, so is it actual knowledge or like is he actually speaking to the other guy? Because I for my essay, I'm doing premise 2, but I don't feel like I have a good understanding of Chinese room thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Zach, did you want to respond to this?
Sure.
Good.
Sure. So basically, we've established that computers are systems that take symbols and they use various equations to create new symbols. They just work with symbolic equations. So Searle's objection to the idea that the mind was just a computer is that it doesn't really take into account understanding, and he explains this through the Chinese room argument. And the idea is basically that you have a little English-speaking man inside a room with all the rule book with all the Chinese characters and saying, if you receive this character, respond with this character, and he's getting little papers with Chinese characters slipped to him under the door and he's responding back. And if he did this, the person outside the door would think that he speaks Chinese because he's responding with perfectly reasonable Chinese characters in response. But even though he is exchanging the symbols for symbols that work, he doesn't really speak Chinese. He doesn't understand anything that's happening. It's just kind of, he's garbage in, garbage out. And that's how Searle argues that a computer which does the same thing but just with any type of English language input and responds with a predetermined answer or something that sounds right, if it doesn't understand what it's doing, it's not thinking, it's not a mind, it's just a machine, or a little version of the Chinese room.
Okay.
Yeah, very good. That was a good statement of the argument. So you get that? So, right, if the computer model is true,
Yeah.
right, understanding just as a matter of doing what a computer does. But Searle points out, look, I can do what a computer does. I can do it, and I don't understand anything.